Ladies and gentlemen, the review for Life of a Marine by Gemini. It's here. And this also includes Bootcamp, the prequel-sequel thing. That, I say prequel-sequel. It came out after Life of a Marine, but it was actually supposed to be the origin story of the protagonist. So that's sort of that. Bootcamp is its own sort of thing, but we'll get into it. We'll talk about it way less than we'll talk about the main Life of a Marine, because it only took 30 minutes or less to beat, so it clearly did not comprise very much of the running time of our playthrough, but we'll talk about it just the same. It suffers from different issues, so let's talk about the main Life of a Marine campaign first. The first thing that you can take umbrage with is the fact that this is marketed as an RPG. Now, even if it were an RPG, the fact that it has no custom mechanics beyond, I guess you could argue some of the boss fights with their triggers are sort of custom mechanics, but like nothing that the player is directly using as a tool is implemented by way of mods or triggers or anything. It's purely just like A-moving, and then you've got a couple of triggered bosses that are very, very simple, sort of set-piece oriented stuff that very clearly wasn't meant to be very challenging, probably because if they had been more challenging or more arcane than what they were, there was no tutorialization and no information control in what we played, so you can sort of expect that maybe there was some internal builds where they were more challenging, but the designer thought, well, it's kind of confusing for players who have never played before, and never experienced anything like this, to come up against something, and since none of the bosses are consistent, it's not like, they can learn from one boss encounter to another. It's pretty much just like A-moving. I guess the final boss battle was a little bit more challenging in that sense, but it's okay. We took care of it. And it didn't really build off of previous boss encounters either. So it's one of those other things where, just again, the only thing that you can think of is maybe having a custom quote-unquote mechanic isn't really consistent with itself, let alone with the rest of the production. So it's definitely not an RPG. However, like I said at the end of the second stream, it did advertise itself as not an RTS, and that's what is important about it. It advertised itself as something other than an RTS, even from the map description of the first mission of Life of a Marine. And that is something that you have to give the developer credit for, even if he was too much of a Mongo to realize that he wasn't actually making an RPG. I don't know if he's ever played an RPG before, but right-clicking and that sort of thing, and walking from point A to point B, and all that stuff, that's not quite what an RPG actually is. So little did he know, perhaps. But with that said, something to consider, the fact that the whole production was never at any point marketed or advertised as an RTS expansion, an RTS experience. That tells me that at the very least, this guy knew he wasn't trying to make an RTS experience, so he didn't bill it as one. And as a result, there was never any expectation on the player's end that they were going to get an even remotely competent production. That last part would be completely accurate even to this point, except people have told me time and again that Life of a Marine either inspired them or was good or whatever. And clearly it wasn't. It's not really even anything to write home about. Like, I don't take offense to this campaign as much as I did for Legacy of the Confederation, for example. And part of that may just be because I had my expectations couched in the idea that this is not an RTS, and it even said so at the beginning. So maybe I had my expectations artificially lowered by that marketing, but because of that, I was not offended by the campaign as much as I thought I would be. It was just boring. It really bored me. It put me right to sleep. And that is something that is obviously a critique. The fact that you're never above 100 APM, unless you're like trying to blow up a critter or something. You're never going to be above 100 APM in these. Certainly it's never necessary, and if you are, you're just giving yourself carpal tunnel. Like, it's not like you're actually trying to do inputs as fast as possible, because there's pretty much no point where the diminishing returns don't outweigh the actual returns that you get. And so you always hit that phenomenon where, yeah, you technically could be right-clicking more often or something, but it would yield you nothing different. Nothing that isn't just completely negligible anyway. And so I'm not really sure what to make of that exactly, but it is pretty frustrating for sure. I guess another thing to consider as well is the fact that just looking at this campaign, once again, similar to Legacy of the Confederation, like I said earlier when I was talking about the reception, the reputation that this campaign has based on other people telling me about it, it's a campaign that has some clout and some people who do hold it in some esteem, and maybe they recognize that it's a really old, dated production, but I'm wondering what possibly could have spurred people on to think that it was worth any praise at all to begin with. And I don't say this, again, to diminish any contributions Gemini may have made outside of Life of a Marine, because as I understand, he is responsible for a couple of other campaigns, but maybe I'm mistaking him for somebody else. I could be wrong about that. I think he's made more than just Life of a Marine, though. Either way, like, even if he doesn't, maybe he helped some other people out, maybe he was a tester, maybe he was doing this. Like, I just don't get it. Like, I literally don't understand why anybody would understand, or why anybody would take Life of a Marine over any other production, right? Like, unless they needed a sleep aid. Luckily, we have StarCraft 2 co-op for that now, but I don't know, man. Maybe it was slim pickings for that sort of thing back in 2002, 2004, whenever this campaign came out. But ultimately, there's really nothing even to talk about. Like, people who are watching this channel probably aren't interested in making RPGs or any sort of micro-oriented thing. If they are, they certainly aren't going to be looking at Life of a Marine for lessons, because it's not really micro, it's not really RPG. And one of the things that Mesk often says, is Captain Mesk, he often says that when somebody says that they've made a micro map, he doesn't really expect this. But if they're competent developers and they're actually mean what they're saying, they are actually meaning what they're saying when they say that, hey, I've made a micro map. Check it out. He expects to open up the map and actually having to, in order to win, you have to micro. Like, that's what he expects. But most of them are just like point A to point B, right click here, right click there, step on the beacon, read some text. Barely even any of them have any voice acting, although that's a pernicious issue throughout all of the content, not just the micro content. And maybe you have to solve some weird puzzles or something, like in Flame Knives or whatever, but it's very rarely do you actually have to be precise. Do you have to, do anything other than maybe some QTEs every now and again, which is also what you would see in Flame Knives. It was very rarely was there like emergent gameplay in these environments that they would set up. And of course, Life of a Marine comes at earliest, it was like 2001, 2002. At the latest, it was 2004, and I don't really have a concrete date for any of these, but it's in that range. Of course, mods have been around for a long time, and there's very easy things you could do to make it so that there's a little bit more competence with this production, a little bit more engagement with this production, but it does a lot, in large part, stem from the map design. The fact that it's pretty much just a bunch of corridors. Like, the most open maps are often the most annoying ones because either there's a lot of backtracking or whatever. But like, we played most of this campaign at a higher game speed than default, than what is fastest, because we just could not stand to slowly slog through everything. We had to quickly slog through everything, and that's sort of maybe that's one of the reasons why I actually am less offended at this campaign, because I was able to sort of cheat in that sense with a speed cheat. It's not really cheating in the sense that it gives me an unfair advantage. It just keeps me from literally falling asleep on my chair while the stream is running, and then waking up and jacking off and embarrassing myself, or whatever the hell I would do in an imaginary situation like that for the bit of a joke. But I just don't understand why people would bother making this or playing this even. I like I said earlier, I get playing anything, or rather making anything, but if you are booting up a campaign and then you see RPG campaign, maybe that would be like interesting, like, oh, I wonder where this goes. But then you play the first mission, it's not an RPG, it's just like a visual novel. Somebody on my Discord server said that it's something about StarCraft custom content seems more as like an engine for people's fan fictions, and that actually does resonate with me, just based on what I've had to suffer through. I'm not really 100% convinced that that's actually what's happening, but it does seem that a lot of people do put a lot of stakes into their story, way more than they bother with actual game design. And you don't necessarily have to bother with game design. That's the thing, is like, StarCraft is a fine game by itself. Definitely has some issues. You definitely could resolve some of them. You could certainly make something better. I often call it the glass ceiling of RTS, because while it is the best, it's not the best because everybody's tried to one-up it and they can't. It's that nobody's tried to one-up it, pretty much. And, maybe the one or two instances of somebody who was semi-competent trying to make something were like Armies of Exego, and they got shafted by a developer more so than they got, overwhelmed by their own incompetence. I would more so blame the developer in that kind of instance. So it's a little bit different there too. But there is something about making a quote-unquote RPG map, but it's just a micro map in an RTS engine, one that is as limited as Brood Wars, that really doesn't rub me the right way. I'm recording this after I've already streamed Eternal Death, which is a modded RPG roguelike type map. It's an installation map. It's by Chalks. He's notorious for being the installation map man. He really likes atmosphere. That's his most, like, that's his favorite game design tenet, or whatever you would call that. Like his favorite element of game design is atmosphere generally. And so I think people could pick up on that when they were watching the stream, and I certainly did while playing it, even if I was distracted by some of the elements that rubbed me the wrong way more. But say what you will about the quality of his work, that's not really obviously the focal point of this review. But the fact that he bothered to implement systems, partially through triggers, partially through modding, meant that it did feel like you were playing a little bit more of an actual roguelike RPG, whatever, than obviously what you see in Life of a Marine. I don't know what you would rate his work as in terms of the technical understanding of StarCraft's engine required to pull off some of the stuff that he did. But I assure you, you can find your way around if you do want to make something that is micro, that is only controlling one unit or a handful of units, that is a bit more set-piece driven, like Life of a Marine was, or maybe just a bit more atmospheric driven, like Eternal Death in this case, the corollary that I'm drawing upon for this review's example. And I don't know, I just feel like it's so obvious that, you would enhance the engine that was clearly not designed for an RPG or a roguelike or whatever with mods, so that you could, just bridge that gap a little bit better and have a bit more of an accurate experience, a genre accurate experience, as opposed to having to worry about, spending a lot of triggers or whatever you would have to do. And Life of a Marine didn't even do that, really. There was pretty much no mechanics, not even any attempts at new mechanics beyond some of the boss battles. Most of it was just them A-moving and teleporting, and I guess that's a different mechanic, but it's obviously done through triggers. It's obviously very artificial. And AI is a big part of engaging with anything, but so too is what tools you have at your disposal. And in macro StarCraft, you have a certain number of units, a certain number of upgrades, a certain number of researches, a certain number of abilities on those units, a certain number of expansions in a map, and a certain number of strategic locations in a map that may not be expansions, but maybe they're choke points or high grounds or what islands or whatever the case may be. And all this combines with, your level design and your tech tree design. Again, even just taking vanilla StarCraft as an example, it's certainly doable. It's certainly passable. It works. It works okay enough most of the time that it's not going to create really bad experiences for players just in engine alone or in that environment alone. And I just wish that Life of a Marine had tried a little bit harder to make something a little bit more competent in that sense. Something a little bit more, I don't know, just actually like an RPG or actually like a roguelike. And that's the most puzzling thing about it, is not... I mean, again, I always say that the most puzzling thing about these projects is the fact that they got any reception at all, let alone positive reception, that anybody bothered to play them to completion or watch somebody else play them to completion, because they're just so boring, or they're infuriating, or there's some combination thereof. And Life of a Marine was mostly on the boring side. Maybe it would have dipped into infuriating again if I hadn't done the extra speed stuff that I talked about, and that is certainly a possibility. But man, you'd think there would be something for you to do in this campaign, and there really isn't, ever. Even on the higher speeds, we were still slogging at certain points. It really just puts that into perspective. Like, imagine how bad it would have been if we hadn't had the speed hack. Wow. Man, that's terrifying. That's terrible. We'll briefly touch on Bootcamp, and then we'll close things up. Bootcamp was very different than Life of a Marine, in that every mission was like 5 minutes long. And there's only 4 maps. Again, it took me under 30 minutes to complete them all, so it's not quite 5 minutes per map, but it's pretty close. It's probably like 7 minutes per map or something on average. And that's shocking. This guy never used briefings, by the way, in any of his maps and any of his campaigns. But, at least in these two, rather. I don't know if he made others. But just the idea that one of the maps was taken from the vanilla campaign. Another of the, like, all of the maps really didn't use their mission space. This is true of the really large maps in Life of a Marine, the basic campaign, the base campaign that we played initially, and for the most of our playthrough. A lot of the times that didn't have full use of its shit either. But just the idea that you would go through and make these tiny maps, and that was submitted for a contest, that really just boggles the mind. Like, I think I'm not exaggerating when I say he probably had to spend more time producing the music that he used in his campaigns, or in his bootcamp campaign, than he had to spend time on the maps. Like, I actually think there was more man hours put into the music than the maps themselves. I think there's way more time. In fact, you could probably make at least one of these maps in the time it takes you to listen to all of the music produced. And I assume that's under a half an hour. So imagine actually making a map for a contest in under a half an hour. Like, what is this, Map Crap or Turbo Edition or something? Like, what are you doing? And is it any wonder that his more set-piece oriented strategy for map design turned out that even his low-effort contest maps wound up being something that you could complete in no time at all, because he's manually creating all of the gameplay instead of designing a framework and environment within which gameplay can thrive. In Gemini's world, it seems that all of the gameplay has to come from the player reacting to set pieces instead of just sort of being able to experience something and make decisions based on their own play styles and preferences as a player, and also on what the enemy is going on, is what is going on with the enemy, what is going on with the environment, what the enemy is doing as far as their own play style and preference. You just got to take people's preferences into account. You know, you just can't date everybody, just like you can't have everybody play your RPG campaign that isn't an RPG. And I guess that really drives it all home for us. Life of a Marine is not something I could ever recommend to anybody. Even like in Legacy of the Confederation's review, I talked about how if you really want to see how bad the community gets and how bad the community's offerings can get, you can play Legacy of the Confederation and suffer through it and repent for ever liking anything in StarCraft, because that's what it'll make you feel like. But in this case, it's just sad. It's just boring. It just puts you right to bed and makes you feel like maybe you should sleep forever. Maybe you should just never wake up again. I don't know, man. It was a very strange campaign. It didn't quite depress me as much as I'm probably making it sound, but it was just very bizarre and very confusing. Like, I don't know why Bootcamp exists at all, because it has nothing to do with the main campaign of Life of a Marine in terms of its, like, the way that you experience it is completely different and very far removed. And it just felt so lackluster to end on that note. Whereas, actually, if Bootcamp never existed, or at least if I hadn't played it, I probably would have felt like, wow, you know, this is, even though Vertigo dies that way, and even though it's just a random Kathy Ex Machina, I think that's the character's name, the Kerrigan Ghost, even though all that stuff comes out of left field, it's really, you know, written terribly and executed improperly. And, you know, even though there's a lot of cringy moments and stuff, and even though all this other stuff happened that was just so bad and boring and silly and dumb and frustrating at times, but mostly just sleep-inducing. Okay, well, it still ended, and it's, even though it came out of left field in a way, it still felt like sort of an ending. And then you just play Bootcamp, and it doesn't even really have a beginning, let alone an ending. So I don't know what you do with that, but maybe you just curl into a fetal position and go back to bed. It's not, I'll let you know when it's over, dude. I'll wake you up when September ends.